Now, scene number 2 transitions in verses 9 to 10, where the wise men are literally led to Bethlehem, where Jesus resided, through a moving star, about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. And you see all of creation coming around Jesus at this point. You have kings. Earlier, we had shepherds, according to Luke, animals who witnessed Jesus' birth. We've had angels. Even the sky above is leading to Jesus. And I asked the question, how could this be? How are the wise men being directed from Jerusalem down to Bethlehem in order to find Jesus? I think Colossians 1:15 kind of tells us how this is happening. It says, Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Then, jumping to verse 18, it says, the purpose clause, that in everything he might be preeminent. Well, Jesus in verse 11 is being cradled by his mother Mary. And the wise men are being led to Jesus' house with this star. Jesus is holding the universe together as this baby. It's incredible, isn't it? So, Jesus at this point, picture this, as a 1 to 2 year old is leading the wise men to himself. You can see how Jesus is powerful and sovereign to draw all men to himself, like he says in Matthew 11:27. Nobody can come to me unless I reveal myself to them. So Jesus is in control of the star. He's the control unit for the star at this point. He's leading these wise men to himself, revealing himself to them. If you look at it this way, verse 11, where we find Jesus is controlling verses 9 to 10, and they're directed towards Jesus. And Jesus will also control our process of finding him, to worship him, and worshiping him as well. I think if Jesus as a 2-year-old could lead these wise men to himself through a star in the sky, how sufficient and capable do you think that he is able to guide us to himself and those who are seeking him? Remember why Jesus is guiding these wise men to himself for worship. He wants them to worship him. Now, verse 10, the light finally arrives, and the wise men witness the King of Light. The light has led to the King of Light himself, the light of the world. John 8:12, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. The light has led to the light. In Revelation 22:16, it says, I am the root and the descendant of David. Jesus continues, he says, I am the bright and morning star. This is the star that we see the wise men coming to in verse 10. Look, at verse 10 it says, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. I think that describes worship. That describes worship for us. Their worship of Christ, think about it, began with rugged determination that would follow this light to the light. And now it has finally ended with great joy. And that defines worship for us. Worship is a matter of our will plus our emotions. Yes, it can take some great willpower and endurance in order to worship Jesus. It takes determination on our part. It can be tough. Not always fun, right? We can worship Jesus in tragedy and loss and in dry scenarios. We can worship Jesus when we need endurance and depend on him. But just because we worship Jesus by willfully seeking him doesn't mean that we lack joy. If you continually do not give up in seeking Jesus and to worship him, it will amount in joy. This joy that starts overflowing with these wise men in verse 10. It says, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. This was like joyful joy, Now in verse 11, the light has led these wise men to the greater light that rules the world, and they have found him. And so as they enter the house, the general revelation that had thus led them this far diminishes under the shelter of that room in the house and a new star arises. Jesus, the star of the show. And I think what they see is what 2 Corinthians 4:6 speaks of. They see, for God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Psalm 19 says, "The day to day pours out speech. Night to night reveals the glory of God." Jesus is the glory here. The night sky with the stars shining has led to the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So what the star did to these wise men's emotion, that is the general revelation star, the greater star Jesus will do to their body in verse 11 as they fall down and worship Jesus. And therein we also see a great kind of more succinct definition of worship, which is responding to who Jesus is. Worship means responding to who you see Jesus to be. Now in verse 11, notice the source of worship. They fell down and worshiped Jesus. Not Mary, not the house, but Jesus. It says, "And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him." They didn't worship Mary. They didn't worship the house as a relic. They fell down and they worshiped Christ. How prone we are as humans to worship all the things around Christ that are spectacular. Like worship the church. Maybe we'll worship, Christ's bride. That's dear to him. We might worship the sacraments. We might worship the traditions, worship the relics, worship religious figures. The wise men don't do this. They don't worship Mary. Some of us are prone to worship Mary. But just because we don't worship Mary doesn't mean that we don't lift somebody else up a little bit too high. It's possible that we worship a religious leader, a pastor, an author, right, a radio speaker in our life, some kind of really influential character who's godly, and we give them a little bit more credit than Jesus. And that's when we're let down, when they aren't perfect. We need to be careful to make sure that we're worshiping Jesus. Because when the wise men saw Jesus with his mother Mary, he fell down and worshipped Jesus, not Mary or the house where she lived. Because they knew why they had come this far. They had come to worship Christ. It makes me wonder sometimes why we come to church, why we go to concerts or conferences that are Christian. Do we go for the speaker? Do we go for the music? Do we go for the people? Or do we come to worship Jesus alone?